A grown man weeps beneath a tree, while a child's distant words prepare to change Western civilization forever. He fathered a child outside marriage and followed a religion teaching that the universe itself was at war with darkness. His mother prayed for his soul for more than 30 years, then died only days after seeing that prayer answered. He would die with enemies outside his city walls, becoming the final great mind of a collapsing Roman world. 16 centuries later, Catholics and Protestants who divided Western Christianity would both claim him as their greatest teacher. He tore himself apart fighting desire, then reshaped Christian ideas of sin, grace, freedom, memory, and the human soul. This is the restless, painful, world-changing story of Augustine of Hippo, the most influential mind in Western Christianity. Take up and read. Take up and read. Take up and read, the distant child repeated beyond the garden wall. A child probably shouted those words during a game beyond a garden wall in Milan, where Augustine heard them clearly. The dejected professor sat beneath a fig tree, weeping and demanding to know how long his divided life would continue. He cried toward heaven, asking whether change would always be postponed until tomorrow, and why his impurity could not end immediately. The child's repeated command sounded to Augustine like words descending directly from heaven at the moment of his deepest despair. Moments earlier, he had put down a manuscript elsewhere in the garden, unable to resolve the struggle consuming his will. Now he returned, opened the book again, and read the first passage his eyes encountered from the Apostle Paul. The passage rejected reveling, drunkenness, debauchery, licentiousness, quarreling, and jealousy as patterns controlling a divided human life. Instead, it commanded him to put on the Lord Jesus Christ and stop preparing opportunities for bodily desire. Augustine responded by making the decision he had delayed for years and finally devoted himself to the service of God. Soon, he abandoned his successful career teaching rhetoric and stepped away from the ambition that had shaped his adult life. That departure began a path making him one of the most influential figures in the entire history of Christianity. Yet the garden only makes sense when we understand why this brilliant grown man had become powerless before his own desires. His story must return to North Africa, to a mother's tears, and to one of antiquity's most divided minds. Augustine was born in 354 in Tagaste, a small North African hill town located in what is now Algeria. His father, Patricius, was a minor Roman official who continued following the traditional pagan religion of his ancestors. His mother, Monica, was a fervent Christian whose persistent prayers eventually accompanied her husband toward conversion before his death. Augustine appears to have shared little emotional closeness with his father, whom he barely mentioned in his surviving writings. Monica, however, shaped his life enormously, and sometimes exercised an influence that Augustine himself later described as almost overwhelming. Both parents recognized their son's extraordinary intellectual gifts and struggled to secure the best education their resources could provide. They first sent him to nearby Madeira, but the family's money failed, and Augustine temporarily returned home to Tagaste. During this idle interruption, he joined companions who delighted in petty mischief, adolescent boasting, and public displays of recklessness. Augustine later said he wandered through Babylon's public squares and treated their moral mud like cinnamon and precious ointments. With these friends, he boasted about sexual conquests, whether real or invented, and participated in pranks he later remembered with shame. He eventually judged those youthful performances as evidence of a deeper desire to be admired, even while doing what he knew was wrong. A wealthy supporter named Romanianus finally financed Augustine's journey to Carthage, allowing the gifted student to resume his education. Augustine arrived at 17 in a city that had long dominated the political, economic, and cultural life of Latin Africa. He studied diligently, but he also embraced the theaters, pleasures, ambitions, and emotional intensity offered by the great Roman metropolis. Soon Augustine took a concubine who remained with him for years and gave birth to his son, Adeodatus. The boy's name meant given by God, or God sent, and Augustine would later recognize his remarkable intellectual promise. Preparing for law or public office, Augustine studied rhetoric, the disciplined art of speaking and writing with persuasive elegance. Rhetoric trained students to win audiences through style, while philosophers carried the separate responsibility of seeking truth itself. Among the authors assigned to rhetorical students, Cicero stood above the others as Rome's greatest classical orator and philosopher. Reading Cicero convinced Augustine that eloquent language was insufficient unless a speaker also pursued truth with his entire life. That awakening redirected his ambition and led the young student toward the controversial Persian religion known as Manichaeism. Manichaeism originated in Persia and was founded during the 3rd century by a religious teacher named Mani. Mani explained the human condition through 2 opposing principles believed to exist within every person and throughout the universe. One principle was light, spiritual, and good, while the other was darkness, identified with matter and evil. These eternal powers existed beside one another, and elaborate myths explained how their substances had become tragically intermingled. Human existence, according to Manichaean teaching, resulted directly from this cosmic mixing of spiritual light with material darkness. Salvation required separating the elements again and preparing the spirit to return into the realm of pure light. There, the liberated spirit would finally be absorbed, restored, and made whole beyond the corruption of the material world. Because further mixing was considered evil, the most committed believers were expected to reject marriage and procreation entirely. Mani claimed the same truth had appeared through many prophets, including Buddha, Zoroaster, Jesus, and finally, Mani himself. By Augustine's lifetime, Manichaeism had spread across the Mediterranean and attracted educated people through its confident claims of rationality. Like earlier Gnostic movements, it connected religious teaching with astronomy and presented cosmic observation as evidence supporting its mythology. Its missionaries also mocked Christianity, especially biblical narratives whose simple language and difficult violence seemed primitive to educated readers. The movement appeared to answer the 2 objections that troubled Augustine most whenever he considered the Christian faith. His first objection concerned style, because the Latin Bible seemed clumsy beside the polished elegance of classical Roman literature. Some biblical stories appeared shockingly barbaric, filled with violence, deceit, and behavior Augustine considered unworthy of educated attention. His second objection was deeper. Monica taught one supreme good God, yet Augustine encountered evil everywhere around and within himself. He desperately needed to understand how evil could exist without making the perfectly good creator responsible for creating. If God created everything, Augustine wondered, evil seemed impossible to explain without somehow implicating God in its existence. Manichaeism supplied a tidy answer by declaring that evil came from an eternal principle entirely opposed to the realm of light. It also dismissed difficult Old Testament passages as writings that never truly came from the highest spiritual principle. Augustine therefore joined the Manichaeans, although uncertainty followed him from the beginning and prevented complete commitment to their discipline. For 9 years he remained only a hearer, never entering the inner circle of initiated believers called the elect. Through the concubine, the unmarried child, and 9 Manichaean years, Monica never stopped praying for her son's soul. She wept, fasted, and repeatedly sought priests and bishops who might confront her brilliant but wandering son. One exhausted bishop finally gave Monica a sentence that would become famous throughout the later history of Christianity. He told her to go in peace because the son of so many tears could not ultimately perish. Monica carried those words for years, while Augustine continued along a path she neither understood nor could control. Meanwhile, his professional career advanced, and he taught rhetoric in Carthage for nearly a decade with growing public success. Seeking greater opportunity and prestige, Augustine eventually decided to leave Africa and establish himself in the imperial capital of Rome. Monica feared losing him completely to the temptations of the city and desperately attempted to prevent his departure. Augustine deceived her by claiming he was merely accompanying a friend to the harbor before returning to her. Instead, he boarded a ship secretly while Monica slept nearby inside a chapel where she had prayed for his safety. He later remembered that deception with shame, recognizing another cruelty against the woman who had loved him most unconditionally. By then, his confidence in Manichaeism was already weakening because its promised rational certainty repeatedly failed under serious questioning. Augustine finally met Faustus, a celebrated Manichaean teacher, praised across the movement for extraordinary wisdom and persuasive eloquence. When Augustine asked difficult philosophical and scientific questions, Faustus could offer polished language but no satisfying intellectual answers. The discovery was devastating. The religion's famous rational superiority appeared to rest on rhetorical beauty, covering profound emptiness. Augustine's reputation in Rome soon secured him a more prestigious appointment as professor of rhetoric in the imperial city of Milan. Milan ranked among the most important cities of the Western Empire and housed the court where political ambition gathered around imperial power. There, Augustine encountered Bishop Ambrose, whose eloquence would gradually guide the wandering professor back toward the Christian faith he had rejected. Ambrose had once governed a Roman province, then became the fearless bishop who defended his church against emperors and empresses alike. Augustine initially attended the bishop's sermons from professional curiosity, studying the celebrated speaker's technique for the advancement of his own career. Almost despite himself, however, Augustine discovered that Ambrose's meaning increasingly mattered as much as the elegant manner in which he delivered it. Ambrose taught him that difficult Old Testament passages mocked by Manichaeans could be interpreted allegorically rather than treated as crude, literal history. Those troubling narratives could function as symbols pointing beyond themselves toward spiritual realities concealed beneath the surface of the written words. This insight quietly removed the first major objection that had originally driven Augustine from Christianity into the welcoming certainty of Manichaeism. During the same period, Augustine encountered Neoplatonic writings, especially the philosophy associated with Plotinus and his sophisticated vision of spiritual reality. Neoplatonism gave him what Manichaeism had never supplied: a rational account explaining evil without turning it into an independent, eternal substance. Evil, these philosophers argued, was not a rival thing fighting goodness, but the absence, corruption, or diminishment of goodness within creation itself. Darkness existed through the absence of light, and cold through the absence of heat. Evil, likewise, represented a falling away from good. This idea became central to Augustine's mature theology and resolved the question that had tormented him since his earliest encounters with suffering. God could remain entirely good while evil existed as deprivation rather than as another divine power competing independently against the Creator. With both objections dismantled, Augustine abandoned Manichaeism, but uncertainty remained and he drifted temporarily into restless philosophical skepticism. Monica refused to abandon her son and eventually traveled to Milan, determined to witness his conversion and arrange a socially respectable marriage. At her urging, Augustine dismissed the woman who had shared his life for more than a decade and had mothered their son, Adeodatus. The separation wounded them deeply, and Augustine later described his heart as mangled, bleeding, and torn where she had taken root. The intended bride could not marry immediately because Roman law considered her 2 full years too young for the proposed lawful union. Rather than remain chaste while waiting, Augustine candidly admitted that he simply took another concubine and continued obeying the desires he condemned. Intellectually, he accepted much of Christian doctrine, yet lust and ambition still governed habits that philosophical argument alone could never overcome. This contradiction brought Augustine toward the decisive crisis that would transform his desires, his career, and the entire direction of his life. A fellow African named Pontius visited Augustine and Alypius, bringing compelling stories about Anthony, the famous Egyptian father of desert monasticism. Pontius also described 2 Roman officials who read Anthony's life and immediately abandoned prestigious careers to pursue a disciplined Christian ascetic existence. Augustine felt pierced by shame because men with less education had accomplished the surrender that his immense learning could not produce. They had committed themselves wholly to God, while Augustine remained trapped between incompatible ambitions and repeatedly defeated by his competing desires. Overwhelmed, he fled into the household garden, and his concerned friend Alypius followed closely behind, without interrupting the approaching emotional and spiritual breakdown. There Augustine wept beneath the fig tree, heard the child's command beyond the wall, and encountered the passage that ended his resistance. On Easter Eve in 387, Ambrose baptized Augustine in Milan after the long pilgrimage through ambition, doubt, philosophy, temptation, and divided desire. Beside him stood Alypius and the teenage Adeodatus, whose unusual intelligence already promised a remarkable future that would never fully unfold. For Monica, the baptism answered more than 30 years of prayer, fasting, grief, patience, and hope that had survived every disappointment. The brilliant and wayward son she had never abandoned had finally entered the Catholic faith she had struggled to plant within him. Augustine, Monica, Adeodatus, and several friends soon began traveling toward Africa, intending to establish a disciplined religious community together. They paused at Ostia, waiting beside the Mediterranean harbor until favorable winds would allow their vessel to depart for North Africa. There, mother and son stood near a garden window and shared an intense conversation about eternal life and the presence of God. Augustine later described the moment as a mutual glimpse beyond ordinary thought, language, bodily sensation, and the passing structures of creation. Only days afterward, Monica became seriously ill and calmly told Augustine that the purpose keeping her alive had finally been fulfilled. She had wished to see him become a Catholic Christian, and God had granted more by making him reject worldly happiness. Monica asked what reason remained for her to continue living after the prayer governing her entire adult life had been answered. A few days later, she died and was buried in Italian soil, far from Africa, with her life's defining spiritual mission finally complete. Returning to North Africa, Augustine sold much inherited property and joined friends in a quiet community devoted to prayer, study, and philosophy. He intended to preserve this contemplative life when he visited Hippo, hoping to recruit another companion for the community at Tagaste. Providence, as Augustine would later understand the event, redirected that apparently ordinary journey toward a public ministry he had never planned or desired. During worship in Hippo, the congregation recognized the famous convert and suddenly demanded that he receive ordination as their priest immediately. Like Ambrose before him, Augustine felt overwhelmed by the public demand and reportedly wept because he considered himself unprepared for pastoral responsibility. The elderly Bishop Valerius welcomed the opportunity to gain such a capable assistant and ordained Augustine despite his visible fear and reluctance. Valerius was a native Greek speaker whose Latin remained weak, so he increasingly depended upon his new priest for public preaching. Although unusual, the arrangement immediately allowed Augustine's exceptional intellectual, rhetorical, and pastoral gifts to develop openly before the demanding congregation of Hippo. Within several years, Valerius recognized his declining health and appointed Augustine co-bishop, clearly intending him to become the eventual successor in Hippo. When Valerius died, Augustine became sole bishop of Hippo and accepted responsibility for the city's deeply divided and demanding Christian population. He would hold that episcopal office for 34 years, combining monastic discipline with preaching, administration, controversy, writing, and pastoral care. The quiet, philosophical retirement Augustine once imagined had permanently yielded to one of the most consequential public ministries in Christian history. From Hippo, his voice would travel across the Mediterranean and shape arguments that continued long after the Roman institutions around him collapsed. As bishop, Augustine inherited the Donatist schism, a bitter conflict that had divided North African Christianity for almost an entire century. During Diocletian's persecution, some clergy surrendered sacred books to Roman officials rather than accept imprisonment, torture, or execution for refusing imperial commands. Other Christians resisted and chose suffering or martyrdom, later regarding those who surrendered scripture as traitors, permanently unworthy of trusted church leadership. After persecution ended, believers asked whether sacraments administered by compromised bishops remained valid, despite the minister's serious personal failure under violent pressure. Donatists answered no, insisting that only a pure and unstained church could administer Christ's baptism, Eucharist, and other sacred rites with legitimacy. The disagreement produced rival churches, rival bishops, and rival congregations throughout North Africa, each completely denying the Christian legitimacy of the other. Augustine entered the dispute with characteristic energy and argued that sacramental validity did not depend upon the individual minister's personal moral perfection. Christ himself acted through the sacrament, Augustine maintained, regardless of whether the human priest proved worthy, cowardly, sinful, corrupt, or morally compromised. This elegant solution would shape Catholic sacramental theology for 16 centuries and protect worship from dependence upon unknowable and unstable personal holiness. Yet the controversy darkened when Augustine eventually supported imperial laws and coercive force against communities that continued stubbornly resisting Catholic ecclesiastical unity. He argued that compulsion might guide unwilling people toward truth and ultimately serve the spiritual good they did not yet recognize. Later generations cited this reasoning to justify religious coercion, leaving a troubling legacy beside Augustine's profound teachings about mercy and grace. Augustine's most consequential theological conflict still awaited him, a controversy ultimately defining Western arguments about sin, free will, grace, and salvation. His opponent was Pelagius, a disciplined British monk alarmed that many Christians used human weakness as an excuse for persistent moral laziness. Pelagius insisted that every person naturally possessed enough freedom to choose goodness and avoid sin through determined moral effort alone. No special additional grace was necessary because God had already created humanity with the ability required for obedience and righteousness. Adam's sin, Pelagius argued, offered humanity a destructive example, but never fundamentally corrupted the nature inherited by later generations. Augustine considered this teaching profoundly dangerous because his entire life appeared to demonstrate the limits of unaided determination and intellectual conviction. Years of restless searching, recurring lust, frustrated promises, and powerless self-knowledge had convinced him that willpower could recognize good without choosing it. His tearful conversion in Milan seemed possible only when divine help broke a bondage that argument, fear, ambition, and discipline had never defeated. Augustine therefore taught that Adam's original sin had wounded human nature and transmitted that damaged condition to every subsequent generation. The human will remained genuinely active, yet its freedom had become bent towards sin and unable independently to choose the highest good. His famous prayer summarized the argument: grant what you command, and command whatever you will from the person receiving grace. Only God's free and undeserved grace could liberate the will sufficiently for a fallen human being to choose goodness and salvation. Salvation was not a human achievement later rewarded by God, but a divine gift governing the process from beginning to end. The controversy continued through councils, letters, alliances, accusations, and increasingly heated exchanges between supporters of Augustine and defenders of Pelagius. Church authorities eventually condemned Pelagius, while Augustine's account of sin, helplessness, and grace became dominant throughout Western Christian theology. Augustine pressed the logic further and developed predestination, arguing that salvation depended entirely upon God's prior and sovereign choice. If unaided human freedom could never choose God, then God must decide beforehand whom grace would rescue from the inherited condition of sin. Many contemporaries resisted this conclusion and feared that strict predestination undermined responsibility, moral effort, God's justice, and the universal Christian invitation. Later theologians called themselves Augustinian while quietly rejecting his hardest conclusions about irresistible grace and an unconditional divine decree of salvation. The Synod of Orange in 529 preserved grace's absolute priority, but moderated Augustine's sharper claims, shaping the legacy received by later Western Christians. Augustine produced an enormous body of theology, philosophy, biblical interpretation, sermons, letters, and polemics, yet two works tower above everything else. The first was the Confessions, a spiritual autobiography written as an extended prayer addressed directly and continuously to God. Augustine recounts with unusual honesty the painful pilgrimage leading from restless ambition, intellectual pride, and uncontrolled desire toward Christian faith. Nothing comparable survives from antiquity because the work combines autobiography, theology, memory, prayer, philosophy, and relentless moral self-examination. 16 centuries later, the book still reveals Augustine's extraordinary psychological depth and his ability to expose hidden contradictions within human motivation. Readers recognize themselves in his divided will, where a person desires one course sincerely, while repeatedly performing another course instead. His descriptions of self-deception, memory, temptation, shame, and longing continue to feel intimate rather than remote or merely ancient. Long before modern psychology, Augustine mapped internal conflict through prayer, remembered experience, philosophical analysis, and unsparing examination of his own motives. The Confessions transformed one man's biography into a lasting investigation of why the human heart remains restless until it finds God. Augustine's second towering work was The City of God, and its immediate origin lay in political catastrophe and civilizational shock. In 410, Visigothic warriors entered and sacked Rome, a city that had remained unconquered by foreign enemies for 8 centuries. The disaster shattered confidence across the empire and encouraged pagan critics to blame Christianity for abandoning Rome's ancestral gods and protections. Augustine answered that accusation through a vast encyclopedic work examining history, politics, worship, violence, virtue, empire, providence, and humanity's final destiny. He described history as the interwoven story of two cities, each organized around a radically different object of love. The City of God arose from love directed toward God, while the earthly city arose from disordered love directed towards self. These communities remained mixed throughout history, sharing institutions and landscapes while pursuing incompatible loyalties and ultimately moving toward different ends. Between them existed an irreconcilable opposition, and only the city of God would finally remain when every earthly order passed away. Kingdoms and nations built on self-love were temporary expressions of the earthly city, however permanent or invincible they appeared to contemporaries. Augustine argued that Rome flourished while serving Providence by creating conditions through which the Christian gospel spread across the known world. Once that purpose was largely fulfilled, the empire received the same destiny awaiting every human kingdom: decline beneath judgment and sin. Even ordinary secular history retained value, Augustine insisted, because everything learned about the past could help readers understand the scriptures more fully. Augustine became the last great Western church leader formed completely within the political and intellectual world of the Roman Empire. During his final years, the civilization surrounding him disintegrated rapidly under military invasion, political fragmentation, displacement, fear, and institutional collapse. The Vandals crossed North Africa, conquering cities until their armies finally reached Hippo and surrounded Augustine's own episcopal home. Now in his 70s, Augustine remained at his post through the siege, continuing pastoral work and writing while enemies camped beyond the walls. He died in 430 before the siege ended, with Vandal forces still announcing a violent and uncertain age outside Hippo's gates. His death marked the final glimmer of the classical Western world, embodied in a mind formed by institutions already collapsing around him. The empire that educated Augustine was dying, yet the theology produced within its ruins was preparing to teach the centuries that followed. Even as Roman power disappeared from North Africa, Augustine's books began the longer journey through monasteries, schools, councils, churches, and nations. Augustine's work did not disappear among imperial ruins. Instead, his writings became intellectual foundations for the New World following Rome's collapse. Medieval monks copied his books repeatedly, preserving arguments about grace, memory, history, sacraments, scripture, society, desire, and the human will. Throughout the Middle Ages, no Western theologian was quoted more frequently or invoked with greater authority than the Bishop of Hippo. The Roman Catholic Church honored him among its greatest doctors and consulted his writings during almost every major theological controversy. Yet Augustine also became the favorite ancient theologian of Protestant reformers who challenged Catholic authority during the 16th century. Martin Luther, himself an Augustinian monk, drew deeply from Augustine's teaching about grace, bondage, human helplessness, and God's initiative in salvation. John Calvin likewise developed arguments shaped by Augustine, especially concerning original sin, divine sovereignty, election, and the dependence of faith upon grace. Thus, both sides of Christianity's Western division claimed Augustine, even while interpreting his complex and sometimes contradictory legacy differently. Catholics found foundations for sacramental unity and ecclesial authority, while Protestants emphasized his uncompromising account of grace and human inability. Augustine became the most influential theologian in Western Christian history, endlessly quoted, reinterpreted, contested, softened, radicalized, and claimed by opposing traditions. His influence extended beyond doctrine into philosophy, psychology, political thought, autobiography, theories of history, education, language, and the study of memory. The story began with a grown man weeping beneath a fig tree because knowledge alone could not heal his divided will. It continued through baptism, bereavement, reluctant ordination, bitter controversy, pastoral leadership, and the composition of books larger than the collapsing empire. 16 centuries later, Western Christianity still carries Augustine's fingerprints whenever it discusses sin, grace, freedom, desire, memory, history, or salvation. Catholic cathedrals and Protestant churches remain divided, yet both communities continue reading the same North African bishop as a foundational teacher. The child's distant command still echoes through his legacy: take up and read the words produced by a restless heart. Augustine's life demonstrates how personal conflict, intellectual honesty, and religious conversion can reshape civilizations long after political powers disappear. The weeping professor became bishop, theologian, autobiographer, controversialist, and teacher of an age he never lived to see.